All right, folks, it's time for a Darkmoon Faire card review. Who could have guessed? They're so rare. And we have some pretty cool cards in this one, like this legendary totem for the first time ever, Grand Totem eys'or here, a new 3-mana 0/4 totem for Shaman. It reads, at the end of your turn, give +1/+1 to all other totems in your hand, deck, and battlefield. So that survival of the fittest style buff that's hitting pretty much everything, but specific to totems here and limited to +1/+1, but coming in at 3 mana. So naturally, if you have a big board of totems already, say like leftovers from a Totem Goliath, you plop this down. That's going to be a pretty significant buff for 3 mana to your full board. And then it's got that upside of also hitting any leftover totems in hand, like maybe your second Totem Goliath, maybe you got a Mana Tide chilling in there, and then whatever's left in your deck as well. So quite a bit of upside here. You got like the Power of the Wild on board, you've got like the Keleseth hitting your deck, and you got like a Smuggler's Run hitting your hand, but limited specifically to totems, which is really gonna be the challenge for this card. The question that it has to answer, are there enough totems to make this worth it? If you look at the totem pool right now in standard, it's kind of middling, right? You've got like Flame Tongue Totem, Mana Tide is this sort of old school staple totems. You've got Trick Totem where it's like maybe that does something cool. You got Totem Goliath. I think I'm forgetting one. You're welcome to look it up. But it's not like this full like totem package. You can't build a whole deck around it necessarily, which means the buffs for this are going to be a little thin, I think. Often you might have 1 or 2 hero power totems on board for this to buff. That's cool, but maybe not the most exciting play for 3 mana. You might have 1 or 2 in hand, etc. And the deck buffs take a long time to come into play, because if you don't have a full deck of totems, drawing one every like 1 in 3 draws, it's going to take a while to actually get those buffs into action. So there's a lot of concerns there. That said, of course, like doing things like duplicating this with Totem Reflection would be pretty nuts, because they're going to actually buff each other as well, because this doesn't buff itself, but once there's 2 on board, they'd buff each other, and then everything would scale twice as fast. So I do think there's really crazy snowball opportunities off of those Totemic Reflections and such, much like we've seen in Totem Shaman already. But the thing is, that Totem Shaman deck we've seen is like hyper aggressive. It's all in. It wants to get some crazy totem on board as soon as possible, start snowballing off of that using early, fast 0 mana totem buffs, and it runs out of gas immediately. I don't think this necessarily fits that deck context very well, because this one doesn't snowball quite as quickly. It takes a little longer to get up to steam because you're playing stuff from hand, you're playing stuff from deck. So it doesn't fit that all-in hyper-aggressive game plan. So this would have to shift Totem Shaman as it's currently played into a slightly slower game plan, which I think would hurt the deck. This may not be enough to really make that thrive, because this is just a one-of legendary. It's hard for a single card to completely change the speed of an archetype, because you're not always going to have this. It's not always going to work. So the question is, does this provide enough to fit Totem Shaman right now? Are there going to be more totems that come in to support this? Is the 4 health enough to keep this alive for multiple turns compared to the normal 3 health total? Maybe, but not really in the world of rush minions. I think this still gets prioritized and killed very easily. It's just not that big. If it's a 0/6, we'd have a conversation about this sticking around for a long time and snowballing. But as a 0/4, I don't think that it does. So I'm looking at quite a few hurdles for this card to overcome. That said, it still does a lot of stuff. It has a very big, powerful effect. So if those cards are eventually printed, that deck comes together, this could absolutely be a centerpiece. So for right now, I'm not expecting much. Maybe over the course of the next year, Blizzard supports it, this card could go absolutely bonkers. Not all cards have that potential. I think this one absolutely could be built around someday, just not yet. All right, so another Shaman card? What's going on here? We're not supposed to get Shaman cards. This is a rare treat. It's the Deathmatch Pavilion, a new 2-mana spell. It summons you a 3/2 duelist, and if your hero attacked this turn, you summon another. This is pointing towards the teaser we've seen for Enhancement Shaman being a thing, this expansion. If you don't know what that means, Enhancement Shaman is like the World of Warcraft build that's more weapon-focused and Wind Fury attack proc and trigger focus. So this plays right into that. If you attack, you get some kind of extra bonus. And in this case, you get 2 3/2 minions for 2 mana, which is nice. That's a lot. Like, you could easily see this coming down on turn 2. And, that's going to be hard for a lot of decks to deal with 2 separate bodies. Maybe they can deal with 1/2, but that leaves behind something. You get some great chip damage through. Chip damage matters when you're a deck that's probably attacking a lot and looking to eventually kill your opponent. So this creates a great early wave of pressure if you're playing it on curve. I should also note this is only ever going to give you 2 duelists. It's not like based on multiple attack triggers. It's binary. It doesn't scale if you're like got Wind Fury or something. So it's capped at 2 3/2s. You're not getting 3 3/2s with Wind Fury. Just because I saw some people asking that question on Reddit when this was revealed. So the question is here, right? Like, is this going to come down early enough in the game to make an impact? Because the later and later you play this, I think the worse it gets really, really fast. So for instance, on turn 4, 2 3/2 minions isn't very exciting. There's like Consecrations and Holy Novas and a million things. The health on these don't scale well enough to make as much of an impact later in the game. They just, get cleaned up with incidental AoEs and random rush minions and weapons and whatever else, right? They just are less likely to be any good because they just don't get big enough. So they don't keep up well over the course of a game. I think you really got to play this on turn 2, maybe turn 3, it's still competitive. So, a 1 mana weapon for Shaman would make this insane probably, right? You got the turn 1 weapon, you got the Deathmatch Pavilion on curve on 2. That's really the sweet spot for this one. Maybe even like a 0 mana spell could help you play this on 2. You're like a Rockbiter weapon sort of thing that allows you to attack for 0 mana would be nuts. Probably not going to exist, but a possibility. So 1 mana weapon, 0 mana spell. This has a fairly good curve with Stormforged Axe. If you play Axe on 2, you overload 1, so your turn 3 is your Deathmatch Pavilion. I still don't know if that's a super exciting play. Stormforged Axe on 2 isn't something we've historically seen a lot of success with in Shaman, but if there's enough overload synergy or the weapon matters enough and that's the only option Shaman has, sure. I think this card would be way, way better with the 1 mana weapon than the sort of Stormforged into Deathmatch Pavilion, because I think already by turn 3, this is starting to feel less and less impactful, which really might be the challenge for this card is it actually doing enough? By the time you get to the mid game, it just feels so weak to me. I don't know if it's going to be a significant enough reload or big enough problem for people to deal with. I guess in some ways you could compare it to like Satyr Overseer for Demon Hunter. It's getting you a couple bodies based on an attack trigger. But the Satyr Overseer has that kind of looming threat where it's going to scale more and more. It forces your opponent's hand a little more than this. These don't have that. They just kind of do what they do, and that's about it. So maybe more efficient at first, but not quite as agonizingly high pressure as the Satyr Overseer. So ultimately, yes, if the Enhancement Shaman thing works, they get the right curve for this card. I think it would be a really annoying set of bodies to deal with, and high pressure enough to make it a good card. If that doesn't come together, you could see this one falling off really hard. All right, next up here is Cenarion Ward for Druid, a big 8 mana spell. It's going to give you 8 armor, and it's going to summon a random 8 cost minion. So potentially a big threat development here for Druid that's also offering you some late game stabilization via that armor. Sometimes it's hard to just plop down a big minion because you're scared you're going to die, but this bundling in the 8 armor means, yeah, you might actually be able to take that risk, develop a threat, and still gain some life along the way to make sure your opponent doesn't just kill you as you start to shift into a late game bomb sort of game plan, which Druid has successfully done quite well. And I think historically I would look to this card and I would have said, man, it just seems really expensive. Random 8 costs are sometimes 5/5s. It's not always going to be a home run. But then I remember it's not really a turn 8 play for Druid. Druid has ramp, so it's really coming down significantly earlier in the game. So, even the low roll 8 drop is still probably going to be like a 5/5 on turn 5 or 6, which certainly isn't an exciting play. But again, if it's helping you shift into a really late game dominant strategy, then that's probably fine to bridge the gap as you move into other really big, crazy threats for Druid. Now, all that said, I still don't think this card is maybe better than just a good targeted 8 drop that has some defensive utility, or even, a 7 drop. So compared to like a Winged Guardian, for instance, I'd probably still rather have a Winged Guardian over Cenarion Ward because it's still providing some survivability, but I also know that the minion's going to be good as opposed to some of the low roll potentials here for Cenarion Ward. But we saw some pretty cool cards already in Darkmoon Faire, things like Solar Eclipse that double a spell for only 2 mana. So you could play a Solar Eclipse, then slam your Cenarion Ward, and you're going to gain 16 armor and get 2 random 8 cost minions. So not only does that help reduce the likelihood of a double low roll, more attempts means less variance. You're going to average out to a better result and minimize those low rolls. but you also get 16 freaking armor, which is a ton of health to help you flip a game back. Even if you fell super behind early, those sorts of plays could absolutely help you stabilize. So basically, is this another option in like a Kael'thas spell druid build like we've seen before? Survival of the Fittest being one of the big payoff spells alongside Overflow. Maybe you could run this one instead or in combination to give you another big payoff spell that's also sometimes just fine to play on its own. When you're slamming around a bunch of solar eclipses, this seems like it has so much insane high upside that it might just be worth slotting into that deck. So is this going to be a perfect fit in every druid list? No, of course not. I mean, clearly token stuff doesn't care about this. A lot of even spell druids might not think this payoff is high enough. Survival of the Fittest could just be more, but it's still a nice big spell that you can do shenanigans with, which means there's opportunity for a card like this one. And then next up here, we have Shadow Clone, a new secret for Rogue. I love that Rogue is getting more secrets. That's awesome. And of course, it's 2 mana, and the secret reads, after a minion attacks your hero, summon a copy of it with stealth. So a couple interesting facets to a card here. We've got a hero-based trigger for a rogue secret in standard format, which doesn't currently exist. So many times if the rogue had secrets up, you didn't want to feel like testing them or figuring them out, you could just kind of go face, and it wouldn't matter. Just who cares about Bamboozle? I can just go face. But now with Shadow Clone, there's a little bit of a risk there. Is this a Bamboozle that I'm going to play into, or is it a Shadow Clone I'm going to play into? Beyond that, this card has some neat stealth synergies where you're very likely to have a stealth minion summoned for you. So you've got those Greyheart Sages and other stealth synergy cards more likely to activate off of a card like Shadow Clone if you're combining a stealth and secret package, which can certainly be done. And then finally is the opportunity here to just high roll into a really big minion. If your opponent only has a 5/5 on board and they disrespect your Shadow Clone, you're going to get a 2 mana 5/5. And unlike Mirror Entity, which can often be very easily controlled and tested for, this one's a little bit harder to test for because certain game states, your opponent might only have one particular minion that can attack. If you play this when they only have a 5/5 that's able to attack face, they have to either hold that 5/5 and it's basically just frozen from a face attack for a turn, or they have to just bite the bullet and give you the 5/5 because they need to get that face damage through, or they're just silly and don't respect the secret. So you create a really high friction dilemma for your opponent where it's like, man, I want 5 damage, but I could take the risk. Maybe it's really Bamboozle, maybe it's something else. And suddenly you have a 5/5 with stealth that you're either using to go face or take a great trade. And you're just happy that you got a high cost minion for a pretty low mana cost. So I think in many ways this would be more awkward than most other sort of minion summoning secrets like Mirror Entity, where they have more choice from hand, whereas this, sometimes their choices will be very limited. Now that said, it still has some backfire moments, I think, too. In a world where there's a bunch of 1/1 lackeys laying around all the time right now, very often this might just summon a 1/1 lackey, which isn't especially exciting. You didn't love spending 2 mana to get a 1/1 with stealth, but if you have enough stealth synergies and that gives you a Greyheart Sage, maybe you're still pretty darn happy to get at least an extra stealth minion, or maybe just having any unavoidable stealthy damage, even as a 1/1, might be worth it for some lists as well. So I just think this adds an interesting new dynamic to Rogue Secrets, certainly has some upside, and feels like a really solid card. Grand Totem eys'or is a 3-star card. Deathmatch Pavilion's a 3-star card. Cenarion Ward's a 3-star card. Shadow Clone is a 4-star card. And there you go, folks. That wraps it up for this early morning review in the Grand Totem eys'or. What do you think of these Shaman cards? Is it going to make sense? Is it going to work? Shaman going to get a 1-mana weapon? Is that Druid spell too expensive? What are your thoughts on all these and anything else that comes to mind? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks much, as always, for watching. And until next time, game on.